From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Terrific. I've been reading your blogs and all the things you've been saying about the topic of today's session, so I know you have a lot of enthusiasm and passion for it. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and it's my pleasure to simply open this session this morning. I serve as the Associate Librarian for Library Services at the Library of Congress, and I have been in that position for about 13 months, taking over from the legendary Deanna Markham, who began this Bibliographic Framework initiative during her tenure at the Library of Congress. And it was immediately apparent to me when I assumed this role that the new Bibliographic Framework was a key priority of the libraries and needed to remain very, very high on our agenda, because its promise is to enable universal, and that's the operative word, access to information regardless of its source, the sector that it originates in, its format, and the time in which it was created. And so this promise is something that we all aspire to. And it, of course, is something that cannot be taken lightly and needs to be done in a very serious and deliberate way, and is also something that the Library of Congress does not intend to undertake on its own. And that's why I'm so delighted to see people here rather early on a Saturday morning, knowing that there were a lot of late parties last night, to learn more about where we are and where we intend to go. I see that some people really didn't get any sleep last night. So we really look forward to giving you this briefing this morning and then continuing to get your input. Kevin Ford will be at our booth this afternoon at 2 p.m. along with Sally McCallum and Beecher and others, and that's booth number 603 if for any reason time does not permit all the discussion this morning. And we are taping the session. It will be on YouTube very, very shortly, and then on the Library of Congress website in about 6 to 8 weeks, because it has to be closed captioned, and that takes just a bit of time at the Library of Congress. So without further ado, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your input and interest, and I will turn the podium over to Beecher Wiggins, who will convene the session formally. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We are delighted to be back before you, telling you what we've done, how we've done it, and getting you involved and engaged in the next steps of what we are launching. Much has happened since we met last in Anaheim. Following the Anaheim session, Elsie mounted the webcast of the Bibliographic Framework that featured Eric updating the larger community as to what we'd done and what we'd shared in Anaheim. In the interim, we took a major step of identifying a group of libraries and organizations to work with us to help test the model that we were developing along with Eric and his staff at Zafira. And we've dubbed those organizations the early experimenters. And they are 6 institutions, and we are happy to say that all but one, I believe, are with us today, and we want to acknowledge those that are on the podium and those that are in the audience so that everyone knows who we are and can have conversations both today and in the days and weeks to come. So the early experimenters are the British Library, and our rep, Corinne Delio, is in the audience. The Deutsche National Bibliothek, the National Library of Germany, and Ryan Hohl-Quelbo is on the podium, and he'll be speaking a bit later. George Washington University, and Jackie Shea is there in the audience representing GW. The National Library of Medicine, Nancy Falgren is there in the audience. OCLC and Ted Fons is here on the podium, and he will be updating us shortly. And then lastly, Princeton University, and I don't believe the Princeton rep is here. In the interval, the library convened 2 meetings of the early experimenters, one in October and one in December, to begin discussions of the model and to see how these institutions could deal with the model and the local data in each of their institutions or organizations. And in fact, it was because these institutions had begun working in the linked data environment and taking on various projects and initiatives related to that, that they were chosen to work with us to make sure we had the broadest participation as we could. They also represented, these institutions, the array of diversity that we were looking for to assure that the model would work for us. Since our last meeting, we have reconsidered our announcement of the past at least 2 meetings of establishing an advisory and a technical committee. We want more experience in working with the model and with this smaller group before we make any further decisions on what committees are best set up to assure that we have the kind of participation and embracing of the community and communities that we can. At today's session, 2 of our early experimenters will talk about how they have used the model and how the model intersects with the local data that is housed and disseminated, stored at their particular institutions. Ted Fun, speaking from OCLC perspective, and Reinhold Hwebel for the National Library of Germany and the process there. Then Sally McCallum and Kevin Ford from the Library of Congress will take the podium and discuss the timeline, next steps, and the tools that the library has or will be mounting that will engage a larger set of players within the community and help us test even further what we're doing. And Eric Miller, lastly, will sort of pull it all together as the person helping us to develop the model and how that is working from the perspective of working with the Library of Congress and the model. We would like to have a single Q&A session at the end because we're trying to cram as much as we can and share that as we go forward. So each of the presenters will talk about his or her piece, and then we will save enough time at the end so that all the questions can come together, and if there are cross questions, then they will also come together. So with this, I turn it over to Reinhold.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share some experiences with you regarding the new bibliographic framework model. My remarks, let me say that, are not by no means comprehensive. I am aware of all the discussions going on during this ALA and on the listservs and several other channels, and I'm sure we will hear a lot about that this morning. By the way, I may not always be able to fully reflect or express the dynamics of the process, specifically not when I'm speaking English. But I can confirm you that there's a lot of enthusiasm in our participation. Experience with the BibFrame model in the German National Library. I have 2 topics to talk about. What is the BibFrame for us? And on the other hand, what can we do for the BibFrame? How can we contribute? I have to look back a few sentences. For us, the BibFrame is the next logical step, and looking back, you know, after a period of about 30 years, we fairly recently mounted ourselves into the MAR community. It was here in Seattle only 6 years ago that I had the honor to present a large discussion paper to MARBI, and now we are using MARC as the exchange format in German-speaking countries. So in some respect, I'm thinking of it as migrational background. We have just migrated from older formats to the MARC format. We have been away for a while, and now we're here again, with some different perspectives in terms of language, which means cataloging language, with some different perspectives in terms of cataloging tradition, and with technical solutions that might be different. We always try to balance standard compliance and our models. And I'm aware that we sometimes push the MARC format to its boundaries. It was maybe not just by chance that a part of our decisions against common practice during the migration to the MARC format may now form ideas and approaches with potential benefits to the new framework. So MARC has been a meeting point for us. And moving on, the BIP frame for us is, as I said, the next logical step. So when BIP frame started, and we at the German National Library were asked to actively take part in one of the early phases, we accepted the invitation, thankfully, and it is really an excellent opportunity to be part of that team, of that group, and of the process as a whole. Learn what you can. That's quoting Eric Miller. I've put onto this slide the semantic web layer cake, the technology stack. I'm not saying I'm understanding a lot of that, but that's where the journey goes to. And a significant part of the process in our German National Library was to learn not just from books or publications, but by bringing together people from the classical bibliographic formats, and on the other hand, experts from the RDF and linked open data side. And we were glad to have both parties represented in our National Library. The linked data service has been set up a few years ago. I've been thinking about MARC design features and their possible equivalents. MARC has been designed originally as a communications format, and I'm thinking about RDF and all the other standards as a communications format, as well as representing to the world, to the web, what you have in your maybe databases or whatever, repositories and all the like. I've been thinking about the concept of the MARC record, and it was an interesting moment sitting side by side, looking to a screen, and one expert tells you that's a BIP frame record, and on the other hand, a linked data expert in our National Library sees that the same thing as a collection of statements and as a named graph. So that was an issue that I felt wasn't really one. It's the same thing. It can be looked at different angles. Speaking about record control numbers and other, other identifiers, they at least resonate with the concept of linking. As soon as it's clear that there's an entity described in this record, you can take the record control number and transform it into something that's a real link, a URI. Speaking of local elements in the MARC format, these 9 field numbers. As I've been told, the feature of extensibility in RDF is built in. It's just possible to add your local vocabulary, and we're fine with that as well. Some other examples stemming from our moving to the MARC format. We like language-independent solutions. So when it comes to designating this relationship is of that kind, we would prefer a code as opposed to a term. And that's an independent solution, a language-independent solution. We have been developing a model for multi-part monographs, for part of them, taking some specific MARC elements, 245$A, N and P, and 773$W for the link, instead of, instead of the field 505. So this hierarchical model may inform thinking about part-whole relationships in the new model. We have preferred to omit ISBD punctuation, trying to more clearly distinguish between the data and the content designation, and not so much intertwine them to each other. And that may be a good starting point for thinking data instead of strings. And then there's the issue of initial articles. The German language, as some other languages, are flected language, so it's not perfectly possible to omit just an article. It has been a JSC proposal, and there has been an option added to the RDA instructions. And in MARC, there are several solutions for that. We would like to see a solution in the new BibFrame model as well, and we could imagine to have something similar like the Onyx format. It has an element title prefix and title without prefix. Speaking to the experiences during the phase from mid-October to mid-December, I have to admit that it was an interesting time for us. The model was defined on a higher level. There were not very many elements visible for us. The schedules were tight ones, and it was intentionally uncoordinated to get a variety, but these caused challenges for us as well. So during our experiments, we sometimes hesitated to just do it in order not to make some mistakes or assumptions. And we, kind of struggled with not yet set DNB priorities and resources in our German National Library. Speaking about authority control, this is one proof of concept and not much more. We had a programmer and a format specialist sit side by side and do XSLT transformation of MARC authority records. And it turned out to be fairly easy, and these are the results. You can see the gaps. There is no living dates. There's no distinction between this is a preferred name and these are other names, but it's real BibFrame data. Speaking of formats and conversions and then transformation processes, I'm getting used to thinking in triangles, and I have to explain that. The Pika format, it's our internal format. It's loosely based on MARC. It has been designed on intermark base. And we convert back and forth to the map format, and now we convert back and forth to the mark format. And we are starting at this point to convert real PICA data, bibliographic data, to the BibFrame model. And it is kind of complicated speaking to international colleagues about the ongoing process from mark to BibFrame, but internally to talk about PICA to BibFrame mappings and conversion tables. The plus of this solution is we are still independent of what's going on outside, so our internal solution for the time being is the PICA format. And in the PICA format, some details are different. There's some more granularity in the equivalent of the field 245, for example. So some issues that we see in the mark format are not there in the PICA format. Possible next steps: learn even more, follow discussions, inform the community in German-speaking countries, and channel back the response to the international community. Of course, continue collaboration in the early experimenters group, and then, as I said, do a real comprehensive and detailed mapping from our PICA format to BibFrame, maybe for bibliographic, maybe for authority, and for holdings as well. And then implement that conversion. So I'm dreaming about, by the end of this year, having a button in our portal for records, show me this record as a BibFrame representation, and a button for maybe comment on that. And we do see the need to collect requirements for the future developments. I've called it for the moment sustainability issues. This is my last slide, looking for a picture that could express the dynamics. It's a ship, it's a famous USS Constitution, and our contribution when we tried to figure out what would be a good acronym for the BibFrame, I came up with a suggestion, as I'm thinking of BibFrame as standardized cultural heritage information flow framework, which sums up to Schiff. As you know, that's the German word for ship. And quoting the captain of another famous ship, the USS Starship Enterprise, we are about to boldly go where no one has gone before. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Ted Fons from OCLC. Similar to Reinhold, I'll give a kind of an impression of my experiences, a little bit about OCLC's thinking about the future. I've got some comments too on the nature of this early experimenters experience, but also the process that we're following, the model that we're following, which I think you'll see differs in some significant ways from a kind of a traditional standards development process. So I'll make some comments on that as well. So so I'll talk about what it is, why is it important, our early experimenters, and then what OCLC is doing here. So the framework itself, this text here that I'm quoting is available on the Library of Congress website. I think it makes some important points that are worth referring to at this point. So some tiny text here I can read for the back. The quote here talks about recognizing that MARC and Z39.2 are no longer fit for the purpose. So the task here is to work with the library and other interested communities. so that's all of us, to specify and implement a carrier for bibliographic information that is capable of representing the full range of data of interest to libraries and of facilitating the exchange of such data both within the library community and with related communities, and I would add, and with the wider web. And I think that's a really important part of what this is all about. And you'll see throughout the comments today that that is indeed really very much integrated kind of into the bones of what this framework is all about. So I actually think this was sort of nicely stated way at the beginning, and it has provided some good inspiration for what we're all about. This is a nice slide. You'll see Sally McCallum has done a presentation that's available on the web that kind of describes what the framework is all about and what's going on. And she's quoting, I think this is originally a slide that Eric did that I think is a nice way to think about a lot of what's happening here. So we're all familiar in this room with the kind of this traditional MARC record, which we know has kind of grown up over the years to represent library data in our library systems. And we have this tremendous community of practice around this format. We have now decades of tradition around it. It was born of a specific purpose around the mechanization of card printing, the early days of automation of library systems. There were some tremendous improvements in indexing and display of that information, but that essential purpose of essentially transforming us from a card-based system to a mechanized card printing and then OPAC system is really very much part of the foundations of that MARC system. And so what this slide starts to say is where we need to move our thinking and our doing is in fact in understanding the components of that data abstracted from this traditional format. So we see circles here around personal names and places and concepts. And so what we're seeing here is in the exchange format a formal recognition that these entities or these main elements are the things where we need to put our focus. And there are ways to do that that are, in fact, more modern than was important when this MARC format was invented. So we say now things like we want to have identifiers for those core entities, so wherever this data is represented, it can be recognized by any system. So this is kind of a core, semantic web concept. Use these identifiers so your carrier becomes less important and systems can get to the content. And when we want to expose library data on the web, get to the content is really what it's all about. And so I'll talk more about how this fits with data aggregation and how we move this forward. But there are some really important, just the picture here kind of it tells a story in a sense, that this format needs to be changed so we can get to these core principles. So let me talk about the early experimenters process and what we've done. The institutions participating have already been mentioned. So it's a relatively short list, although I have to say that the individual contributions, from these institutions have been tremendous. The kind of process that we've used since the fall, when this early experimenters process began, is different, I think, from the kind of traditional standards development process. So, the way I've experienced that, and many of you have, I'm sure, is that we have this kind of panel of experts brought together to discuss and debate some problem and then propose some format, and then there's more discussion of that, and some time progresses there, maybe a lot of time progresses there in that traditional process, but we have this essentially kind of single thread. It's just going forward towards some eventual unveiling of a new idea or a new standard. And what we're trying to do here, I think, is something that represents more agility in that process, even in the library space. So I was lucky to find this picture. So if we think about in our environments, how could we do these things, faster, with better feedback along the way, so we're not relying on this sort of, waiting for the experts, to be done process. So I compare this to kind of the new methods for developing software and systems. So kind of the traditional approach, which people call a waterfall process, which is moving forward, waiting for this eventuality. We have this process where you discover some requirements, some design happens, something gets developed, some testing happens, and then this whole thing, then the water hits the bottom of the waterfall, right? And then everybody has to react to it. And so in all this time, in this picture, if you can't see at the back, the bottom says one release. So all this work has happened in all these stages. Maybe even lots of time has passed. Time enough for the market to change, or time enough for the requirements to shift. So this is, while logical and actually has lots of tradition behind it, is it considered now kind of an outmoded way of doing things because of that problem on the bottom. Our time arrow is passing, and nothing happens until the end. And so what we've been thinking about in this BibFrame process is something that's more iterative, has more cycles to it, where we see this kind of, test, discover, design, develop, discover, test, design, develop, discover, test. And so we have these sort of loops. And that's what we've been doing in our own conversations within the expert community, our early experimenters, kind of trying things, telling each other about it, sharing some things, and then moving forward. And we see this process sort of accelerating now as we've gotten more experience. So this isn't meant to be sort of a lecture on software development, but really kind of the idea that we're trying to approach this differently. And then we'll see kind of an expanding community take part in this process. So just in terms of, so that's kind of a basic description of our methodology. In terms of the timeline, so we've seen, we had the BFI announcement a couple of years ago now. We had the LC publishing the model and the first workshop happening at the end of last year. Second workshop happening at the end of last year. Kevin's going to tell us some stuff this morning about some public resources around this. And then throughout this phase, this sort of experimentation and feedback. And I've got it going a bit longer. That's speculative. But you see sort of the bottom bar is where, we will release, discuss, look at what we're doing, get feedback, which is a change, I think a shift from a traditional process. So a few details, just so you know what's been happening within the early experimenters community. So first workshop, we discussed and debated the model that was proposed. We saw some demonstration software from the Library of Congress who had kind of a preview on the model, and then we discussed an experimental phase. And we said we were going to do that in 8 weeks. Not a year or 18 months or so that was a significant change. Then we had the second workshop and we discussed our findings. So we shared here's what we did, and some of us did some development projects, did develop some software, did some experiments. Others did sort of more, thought experiments or reviews and sort of analysis, and then brought that forward. And so sort of the output of that was, some software at LC, some processes at OCLC, some good presentations by the early experimenters, and that's pretty much it. So we had some PowerPoints, we had a little bit of software, and we had some data output. That there wasn't anything else sort of, behind this process. But it was very useful in this sort of iterative way. So let me talk just a couple of minutes about what OCLC is doing in this time. So quite a lot. So you can see here participating in this early experimenters process. So two of us, myself and Jean Godby from the Office of Research, we've been attending the workshops. Some of our other staff from the Office of Research have been attending or listening in on the listserv and contributing there, and then also developing some processes. So we actually did a project to convert all of the WorldCat bibliographic data, so the bibliographic records in WorldCat, into the BibFrame model, so we could see what it looked like. And we had lots of tools already in the Office of Research kind of in our back pocket to do that. So the process didn't actually take that long. But it's taken us a little while, but recently we've distributed some of that experimental data to the other early experimenters so they could start to give feedback and tell us what they think about what we've done. And now we're involved in a process to kind of study and discuss some of the main issues or problems that we're encountering. How do you model collections? How do you describe them in this environment? What about the concept of authority going forward? And this, what I call here, the dynamic of library data and web exposure, which is this really kind of complex problem of getting our library data more exposed. Long-term, providing services for new metadata workflows. So we expect all of this to provide some inspiration to all of the library systems out there to focus on these entities, as I talked about, to focus on the important elements of the data over the kind of traditional, massaging the MARC record. But this idea of sort of this dynamic of managing the library data on the web is something that is of deep interest to OCLC. So as you may know, we spent some time last year essentially doing a linked data representation of the WorldCat data on worldcat.org. And our goal there was to see if we could use web technologies, to use the schema.org style of representing the data so it could be more accessible. And we see this activity as a continuation of that. And so one of our sort of specific areas of interest is how can we align or make sure that this BibFrame activity isn't incompatible with some of these broader mechanisms for representing data on the web. And that's something that we've taken on as kind of a specialist topic among the OCLC staff. So just a brief view here. This is one way to represent BibFrame data in a particular flavor of linked data representation. And you'll be familiar with some of these things, like there's certainly identifiers in there now in the form of URIs. We have things like titles and authors and creators. Probably the biggest contrast between what we see here and the kind of traditional data is this presence of identifiers throughout the data in the form of web accessible, web consumable URIs. So if you'll remember my points from the beginning, we need to understand the core entities that are in the data. We need to represent them in the way that's relevant to other systems and that can be consumed on the web, and that strengthens our own data through consistent use of canonical URIs. And you see all that kind of sprinkled through this example data. Another sort of interesting fact probably here is this prominence of the work in the data. So those of you who've engaged with RDA will be familiar with the sort of prominence of the work itself. That's really important here as kind of a core principle. This is a very crude sort of mock-up that we did in the interest of doing things quickly, just showing, one of the millions of records that we converted, showing sort of work level data, identifiers, and then this sort of manifestation item level detail in the middle. Very crude, but was helpful for us to see, what was working and what was not working. I mentioned, this idea of examining, how we can make sure that this work is compatible with emerging web standards. And so this is a way that we like to think about this, these sort of inverted pyramids, right? So, schema.org, the base of the top pyramid has this wide, web availability. And things like BibFrame and potential library extensions are sort of, in the middle, and then we have all these other specialist library domains. So we want to study that these things fit together. Just a couple of more comments, sort of, what is OCLC doing? So short term, the sort of experimentation and thinking. Long term, the way we think about this is workflow improvements, changes to real library workflows, through our own sort of native OCLC applications, but also through other applications where we can expose services directly. Integration with library data on the web, and so, improvements of workflows through work services, the emergence of identifiers as a key component of cataloging work, and the sort of Ferber model we think is quite important, embedded in the metadata flow, and then library exposure on the web. And just last comments here, some of our kind of future thinking, aggregate the data, make it accessible, mine these data sets, structure and expose data sets as linked data. So this BibFrame work is very important to that third bullet there. We think of this sort of transformation from, what was originally kind of a card automation to this sort of entity view that we saw at the beginning. And that really has to sort of replace, the core of library metadata management. And so, some of these are some of our thoughts about the future of WorldCat, and I think they're consistent with the principles of BibFrame. So I think Beecher mentioned we're going to do questions at the end. So I'll give up. I think Kevin is next. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Hold on a second. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, hopefully, the blue screen. I'm still going to talk about the blue screen. In the meantime, while I talk about the blue screen, I want to basically thank Ted in part for talking a little bit about the process that we're undergoing here, and really the courage at a certain level that the Library of Congress and the earlier experimenters have sort of taken to try a new process in which to basically work on a very important task. This process is actually one that's been used quite frequently in lots of web-based standards development. It's been key to the development of the web, and the application of this social process in other communities is sometimes quite a challenge. But what's occurred in the past, really, 6 months from when we first started talking about this at ALA last has been absolutely amazing. And what you're going to see through the course of the earlier experimenters and additional work that's gone on here in the bibframe.org site is really sort of a testament of, I think, this particular process in action. So it's actually quite fascinating. What I've been asked to talk about at a certain level today is really the web. We'll talk about BibFrame, but it's really the web as a platform and BibFrame as a framework in that platform that really weaves libraries, users, and the best of the web together. I've been sort of thinking back a lot about some of the early days of web development and some of the craziness that ensued at that time. But looking back, it is amazing to see how powerful this platform and how pervasive and how quickly this platform has just penetrated the entire globe, and how amazing as just the most successful commerce and communication platform that has ever been conceived. And with the recent developments of some of these horribly named standards, the underpinnings of a lot of what we talk about in terms of linked data and the semantic web, it's really becoming one of the most pervasive data management and integration platforms ever imagined. I want to sort of pick on two companies that sort of serve different aspects of this data integration and aggregation paradigm. And I want to distinguish them in part by sort of search and discovery. Search, Google's a fine example for folks. It's become so pervasive, everyone sort of knows the name. You type in a string and you get stuff back. Facebook and other kinds of social network, you're not typing in strings. What you're doing is you're building up lists of connections to friends, to colleagues, and you're allowing that stream of information basically to be filtered out by trusted sources that you've connected with. Facebook is sort of a very high-level social aspect, and it covers a wide range of different things. But that paradigm has been applied and is making huge strides in ways in which scientific collaboration and scholarly communication is doing. So this notion of sort of searching on one end and discovering through trust networks on another is really sort of an interesting paradigm that's basically occurring. What's happening right now, literally in the past 6 months, is an interesting if you can think of sort of search on one point and discovery on another, a very interesting blend that's occurring between these two. In the past 6 months, you may have noticed on the right-hand side of Google search results, no longer are you looking at just a search string and search results. But now you're looking at, in essence, a new search augmentation service called Knowledge Graph that as you type in a name, it connects with a thing. And it uses that thing as a way of binding together a tremendous amount of other stuff about that thing. So typing in Albert Einstein, on the left-hand side gives you a tremendous amount of stuff that the folks have talked about Albert Einstein, but on the right-hand side, it's connected to recognize the fact that it's a person, it's connecting images about that person, statistics information about that person, birth dates, death dates, books that are about that person or that person wrote. It's building up this very powerful knowledge web that allows you to navigate through that, and as you navigate through that, refine the search that basically is going on. Ted mentioned a little bit about schema.org. To help both the knowledge graph and search ranking results, Google, Yahoo, Bing, and several other search engines have sort of come together to say, look, this is, let's be clear, it's not a cooperation, it's more of a coopetition. But recognizing that these organizations, while having different business models, share a common goal in seeing more structured information available on the web. So it's exploring how best to start to inject and help end users stick structured information on the end, in the web, so they can start to basically do new and interesting things. One of the things that I haven't heard yet here at ALA, but you will hear definitely in the next 6 months, is Facebook coming at this from the other side. So Facebook, in essence, everyone that's on Facebook is the product, right? We are creating this content and linking and liking and connecting to individuals. And that graph of web information is now being turned into a search engine, and at an invitational beta, basically Facebook's calling this graph search, but it's things like show me all the people that like cycling that live in Seattle, Washington. Or, show me all the restaurants in London that my friends have basically gone to. Or show me all the books that my friends like. Or show me all the friends that like science fiction. So through the fact that we're making these sort of small connections with our friends or to books or to places to eat or to things that we like to do, we're starting now to see end-user consumable tools to sort of help us navigate that information in new and interesting ways. And I think this will be an extraordinarily interesting development in the next 6 months, if for nothing else to remind people in Facebook to set their privacy settings. But we'll get to that later. What's making all of this possible? The web. It's not these companies. The web is enabling these companies to do interesting and powerful things. We're moving from a very simple notion, the early notion of the web, which is a bunch of, decentralized identifiers, web keys of things that link to other things, to types of information, persons, places, concepts, that have specific relationships that exist to them, likes, dislikes, is dependent on, lives at. So we're moving, using the web as a platform, not to just link documents together, but starting to link data together. And now we're seeing two very simple end-user examples of what the potential of that is going to enable sort of moving forward. And what's exciting about that is that it's all still part of the general web. It's all still, it's not locked, it's not a proprietary solution. It's value add on top of a linked data platform. This notion of sharing and connecting data using the web as a platform and unique identifiers is starting to not only accelerate in terms of how different communities are doing search and discovery, but reducing the costs, both the social and technical costs, for how we as a community can benefit from that. And what's really exciting, and sort of looking back at sort of my small involvement throughout the process of this, in terms of libraries and semantic web, what's really exciting to me is this particular effort. More than anything else, I think this BibFrame effort has the potential of really placing the library community, the cultural heritage, back in the prominence of the community that it's lost over the past several years in terms of the web. And reconnecting scholars and users and patrons to credible information that basically has been at a certain level lost due to other popular concepts that basically are taking priority. So what BibFrame is at a certain level is building off of the very web infrastructure, this native web framework, this linked data for bibliographic data. It's designed not only to sort of be a robust framework for sort of looking back at the amazing content that we as a community have created for the past 40 years, but be flexible enough to and adaptable enough to deal with new and interesting concepts and new and interesting data that our patrons might care about 40 years from now. It's content model agnostic in the sense that there are lots of different ways that we recognize that people might describe stuff, but how do we build the sort of building blocks that allow us to carry that forward and start to connect, not just as Ted was talking about within the library community, but outside of the library community and the larger user community at our fingertips. And benefit, in fact, from all of the goodness that the web has to offer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the very specific implications of that here in a second. So we're working on, as Ted mentioned, a process for creating, the model and pipelines for communicating this information and tools for surfacing this, so that instead of, simple documents that link to other documents, we're talking about books and instances, and we can start to stitch these particular things together. So in this particular case, Kurt Vonnegut's Bluebeard, we're talking about, a conceptual notion of a work, specific relationships to Kurt Vonnegut, specific relationships to the topics that this book is about, madness and love, all the other things that are related to it, instances to, the physical manifestation, the carrier of this, a hardback edition, a paperback edition, and then from there, who published it, where, when, et cetera, et cetera. And we can start to basically stitch in a decentralized way, not just the descriptions of the information, but translations of the information, et cetera, and use the web to sort of take these sort of small building blocks of descriptions and start connecting them together in a very agile and flexible way. And this notion of sort of recombining these small sort of building blocks is a really incredibly powerful one. My children do it all the time. And that simple ability of sort of stitching together these small building blocks to create larger ones is a very powerful one. I mean, in this particular case, this is an individual with way too much time on his hands, but has taken these sort of small building blocks to create something greater than the sum of the individual parts. And that small building blocks of information, those small building blocks of linked data, are based on, a very concerted effort from a lot of different folks, from a lot of different communities, coming together and trying to define a set of standards and technologies that represent these sort of small information atomic building blocks. And RDF is an example of one of these standards that basically sort of says, this is how to build a small Lego of information on the web, using the web as a platform that can easily snap together with other chunks of information that are there. And it's really based on using the web, the unique identifiers, and being very clear about the relationship that basically exists between this. In a traditional entity relational model, for example, entities are sort of these magic things, and then there's these sort of secondary relationships. On the web, the relationships are key. Your information is proportionate to the number of links that point to it. That kind of ways in which you can connect that information is key to new ways in which folks can discover it. And RDF is some of these building blocks that make that possible. Legos, the reason that you're able to snap together Legos and make those satisfying clicks is because the engineering tolerances of Legos are in that of an internal combustion engine. And the Legos of 50 years ago snap together with the Legos of today. So the RDF at a certain level is a very similar low-level engineering bits that allows us to sort of build these small little atomic web-based building blocks. The problem with RDF is, in essence, it's very small atomic building blocks. It's intentionally underspecified how communities assemble those building blocks in new and interesting ways. There's been a lot of discussion in the past 6 months, 12 months here at ALA and others about how do we create patterns for linked data that make sense. Just because you publish everything in RDF doesn't magically mean it'll snap together. It could snap together, it just might not be in a shape that actually is at all interesting to you. But what we're trying to do with BibFrame and what we're trying to do with the early experimenters is to build a little bit, not just the atomic building blocks, but sort of shapes and sizes and colors, more complex building blocks from those atomic ones that we in the cultural heritage community care about. So we could start to assemble these small patterns of building blocks and start to use them in new and interesting ways to create profiles that we, the community, might care about. Making the simple thing simple, like maybe a little Angry Bird shape, and the complex things possible, far more difficult shapes, but all using the same small patterns that we can use over and over and over, so that we reduce, again, the social costs and the technical costs for creating this content and starting to basically use it from one application to another. So I wanted to take a quick step back to the sort of Bluebeard example, because not just the benefits of the web of being able to snap together, but the web as a platform has new ways in which we as a community can start to think about how to build off of each other's cooperative nature. So in this particular case, at one particular time, Bluebeard came out in 1987, first edition, hardback edition, et cetera, et cetera. 20 years later, Italian translation, paperback, different publisher. The Italian translation in this particular model is going to basically use some of these atomic building blocks to describe their resources. BibFrame, in general, sort of allows this to be constructed in different ways, but the fact that Italian translation can now point to or connect to the original translation, it has huge implications on the web. And what I mean by that is, depending on, by a particular BibFrame object connecting to another BibFrame object, instantly you don't know those connections are there. But as soon as somebody travels through the web, as soon as someone makes that connection from one link to another, we can start to imagine, and this is what the web provides, little breadcrumbs that basically happen as we move from one link to another. We see these links, we can travel these links, and we get notified, in essence, that these new incoming links are occurring. This is not the future, this is what's happening now. When someone likes something and you get notified, when somebody blogs and somebody else talks about it, you start to see all the incoming links. This notion of being able to use these links as a way of notifying of how these things are connecting together is a very powerful one. So in this particular case, new links coming into old records, I might see you might see and imagine very quickly new kinds of not just cataloging but catalinking interfaces that allow you to then go update and reconnect and recontextualize this information in a much more general, decentralized web environment. And there's wide ranges of ways that this is happening right now. So in the left-hand side of this slide is the Albert Einstein knowledge base knowledge graph example that I used in the previous slide, anyone can go and basically assert in this particular model that, in fact, this information is incorrect. It doesn't basically instantly change it, but it gives triggers to the folks that are basically creating this knowledge base of whether the community thinks this information is right or this information is wrong. This is Facebook's notion of Albert Einstein. I can assure you he never logged in, but Facebook is, just as Google is creating identifiers for these different concepts to snap things together, Facebook is creating identifiers for all these things to snap together. In fact, there are over 4 million people that like Albert Einstein. But what's happening is that's actually becoming a very interesting pivot point in which different people are basically connecting together. So if anybody basically talks about Albert Einstein, all 400 million people get notified of this. You know, it's a very interesting way in which this information is starting to connect together. Now, the identifiers and the services around one business model for Google and the identifier and services around a completely different business model for Facebook are incompatible. Not surprising, they serve different business models. But as these different business models create connecting and minting new identifiers for this concept, and as new people start connecting, each of these different business models, these search discoveries, they're aggregating information and presenting this information by a wide range of different characteristics, by popularity, you know, by purchase. You know, if I pay more, I get, you know, I see my data aggregated more, by internal special sauce. It's a common web-based infrastructure, but the different business models are creating different ways in which that information is presented to the user, and the user doesn't know this. The user doesn't know if the information that's being aggregated is credible or not. The information is presented to this aggregate information because of, at a certain level, you know, a black box that it doesn't understand. The users don't know the difference, and when anyone can start saying anything about anything, and different business models are aggregating things based on different priorities you don't know about, who do you trust becomes a very key part of this equation. So these different business models are lowering the technical and social costs for the underlying standards, but they're also increasing the issue related to credible information and how that information is being aggregated. And this is a very important part of this. As different people start connecting this up and start relating this information, the who do you trust is going to be an important part of showing how that information gets snapped together. And in essence, this is a huge opportunity for us as a community. I don't think of BibFrame, and it's important for us not to, as just a replacement for MARC, but rather a mechanism that basically takes the physical trust that the library community has created and applies it into the web. It provides us a mechanism in which we can weave the best of the web, the best of credible information that the cultural heritage community is creating and connecting and catalinking to the users and the knowledge that they're creating around it. And really introduce, using the same technologies and the same framework the web has to offer, a means in which we can expose our credibility back into the very fabric of the web. And that's what's actually very exciting here. So I'm going to stop here and talk a little, and let some of my other speakers talk about some of the other work that's happening and some of the services that are coming online to really start to expose this information to the web and start to build that credibility. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everyone for the very interesting discussions about what we're doing and where we're going, what the future can look like. I'm going to talk more about some reality of this year and next year, what we sort of see as a roadmap. This is the picture on the screen, which is the only one I'm going to put up, is the roadmap that was developed last September. So, in fact, where we are is not exactly on that roadmap, but we're sort of toward the end of the short-term goal area. We have done the landscape document that was done by Zafira in that document that was published on the website, and the model, the high-level model. We did some pipeline development, and we put it out for download by programmers in December, and services, Kevin Ford is going to talk about a service in a few minutes that we will be putting out, that we have put out. We've had the early experimenters sprint, the first sprint for them. They will be continuing to work, but they did that first very intense investigation of the high-level model, as somebody said, without very much guidance, but simply everybody sort of do it looking at it from your own perspectives. I exposed some questions, nature of authority control, what how do annotations work, annotations of the model, what are the aspects of holdings, various things like that. So 2013, that's where we are now. This is going to be, and it's sort of the end of the short-term goal area, and I think the beginning of the medium term. With services, we want to, the one that Kevin is going to be talking about and others that we hope will have, will enable the community to join the discussion better. They will, the software that we put out for download in early December really enable programmers to join the discussion, but the software that's coming will enable the general community, and Kevin will tell you more about that. Broader experimentation, that's what we want. Refinement. Through lots of testing by various people, by getting broader perspectives, by throwing out questions and getting the community to buzz around them for a while, we want to be able to refine the model, alter the model, expand the model, various things of that sort. At one level, we're looking at marked data, shoving marked data through, but we also are getting to a more detailed level. We're developing a vocabulary based on RDA, and where RDA overlaps. Mind you, a lot of RDA is not, a lot of what is in MARC is not in RDA because it's subjects, it's administrative data, it's other kinds of data that RDA does not, intentionally does not treat. We want to look at different content models. We're going to be working with some people to work at looking at CCO in BibFrame and DAX in BibFrame, different aspects. We also want to provide, if we can, a simple interface for data creation so that people can not just put a MARC record through and see what it looks like on the others when it becomes a BibFrame document, but also to be able just to input data from the beginning. We're going to look at the communications aspects of the model. We're going to focus first on use cases, a lot of what are the communications use cases, because after all, this is a communications format that we're replacing. It's a communications format that we're looking toward, and it's a communications environment we're trying to hook into. We're going to look at current communications protocols that we all depend on, Z-Ether 950, SRU, OAI. How will BibFrame interact with those? We know they're, and we're also going to look though at the projected communications environment because we want web-based. We want new communications environment. We want to latch into the new communications environment. We're also going to look at current environment characteristics such as copy cataloging and integrated systems that have to continue to function with sort of a very, very different data model under them. We're going to look at community communications. We have a website, we have a listserv, we have some software download, we're going to have a transformation service, but we want to organize our feedback better. And so that when a lot of comments are coming in through the list, we sort of organize them a little bit, figure out how to use them and sort of feedback on that. We want to start to bookkeep our issues and resolutions a little bit better this next year. We're doing all this in 2013 with the dedicated staff at LC, which are actually dedicated totally to this project. The Zafira team will continue to help us this year. The early experimenter team will continue to help us, have agreed to continue to help us this year. Experimenters with resources, those are people, the experimenters who not the early experimenters, but any other experimenter who can take that software and do something with it and want to join the really technical discussion, but also community participation, because we're beginning to get to a point where we can have, where catalogers who don't necessarily want to deal with software or some of those issues can talk about the data elements and the entities and where have they gone. So that's 2013. That's a lot, and we'll see what we can do. 2014. Then we'll be fully in the medium term of the roadmap, we expect. We will be finalizing aspects of the framework. So if you thought something was final now, it's not. If you think something's going to be final very soon, it's not. But we do expect to be able to start finalizing aspects of the framework by 2014. We'll be working with your system builders to enable them to consider what adjustments they might need to make or consider how they might exploit the new framework to offer new types of services to improve what they already do, to change what they already do. We will be doing system experimentation with some new open source systems, with experimental systems and of that sort. So for a final note, this roadmap is general. This year expectations that I just went over are general. The change is colossal, though, and the unexpected will happen, we're sure. Thank you.
So good morning. My name is Kevin Ford, and we wanted to take the opportunity to use this moment to introduce everyone to bibframe.org, a website that went live at about 10 o'clock this morning, and I've already, in fact, submitted a bug patch. So I'm going to actually attempt a very worrisome live demo of this website. But this actually dovetails nicely with what Ted was speaking about earlier about this being a very rapid development, iterative approach. But we're trying to get it out there. We want to get it out there. We want to expand the conversation. As Sally noted, we released code earlier that developers were in a good position to evaluate. But in the interest of expanding that conversation and bringing more of the community into it, we wanted to publish a very public website where we have posted a vocabulary in addition to some demonstration data and views, and provided some tools for the community to use to evaluate how their marked data might look according to conforming to the BibFrame model. The vocabulary that we've made available is complementary to the high-level BibFrame document we published in November. It is equally high-level, and you'll see that there remains much to be done with the vocabulary, much greater specificity that needs to be drawn out from our data. But as you browse it, you will be able to see the types of resources that you might have, in this case, a BibFrame work, properties that are that can be used with a BibFrame work. And as you scroll down the page, you'll see there are many more. We have made an attempt. It's a kind of a rough notation right now that we need to find a way to make a little bit more human-friendly, provided what we believe to be a reasonable mark mapping given the first pass. There will be more specific types. You can see there's dissertation and cartographic here, which in fact are types that derive directly from the marked format, but you can imagine that this will grow as we continue to refine the model. And what that means is that in this particular case, a dissertation is a type of BibFrame work. It inherits all of the classes that are, all the properties that can be used with a BibFrame work, and in addition to those, has a few properties that are specific to dissertation type. Like I said, there are some in demonstrations. All of our earlier experimenters gave us some marked data. We have taken that marked data and converted it to BibFrame and posted the resulting transformations under the Demos tab of the menu. And you can click on any one of these and see what some of the earlier experimenters' data will look like conforming to BibFrame. We've given it a human display using Exhibit 3, which is a framework for displaying, for making it easier to view data. But in addition to that, we provide direct links to the MARC XML that in fact has been used to produce this page, the BibFrame RDF XML, that's in fact what you're the data, which is in fact the data that you're seeing, and the exhibit JSON, which is just a serialization of the BibFrame RDF XML that exhibit requires for it to display nicely. One of the other additional things that we have done is we have in fact created basically linked data out of all the MARC that comes into the system. So if you want to look at some of the information surrounding this subject more carefully, you can in fact click on it. And at this point, it will take into a straight data view, but that is in fact the data sitting behind that particular subject heading. One last thing I wanted to demonstrate this morning before moving swiftly to questions are the tools There is a comparison service and a transformation service. The comparison service, and I need to modify the text on this page, basically accepts a bib ID, an 001, from any record in the Library of Congress database. It will grab the MARC record from the Library of Congress database, transform it into a BibFrame representation of the same. And you could basically put any number in there from 1 to 15 million, and you should be able to get something back. So here's the original MARC XML and the resulting BibFrame RDF XML from that transformation. If you have your own data, we are providing a transformation service right now. There will be a way to upload a file. That isn't, I commented it out because it encountered a problem, but we'll get that fixed. But if you point to a MARC XML file that is hosted on the web in a web accessible location and hit submit URL, we will fetch that MARC XML, we will turn it into BibFrame resources for you, and we will display it in Exhibit in just the same way you saw the earlier experimenters' data in Exhibit. And you can view your own data in a pretty HTML view, also get at the resulting transformation from it. The paste RDF XML works in much the same way. You can plop it in there, and you hit submit URL. It'll take that data, create BibFrame data from it, give it a URL, and you will be taken to the resulting presentation. And in fact, all of your data would suddenly, not all the data that you submit would in fact be linked data at that point too. You can look at any of these items. There are still, as you can see, some character encoding issues to work out. But if you want to see what the data sitting behind this particular instance, you can click it and see the raw data. The code running this is in fact the exact same code we made available to developers earlier. That code will continue to be, the transformation code will continue to modify that transformation code as time goes by. But of course, you're welcome to contribute. It's on GitHub. The code running these transformations on GitHub, so if you want to go back and talk to your developers about this and perhaps use it for yourself, please do. And that ends my portion of this. Thank you.
We apologize that we are nearing 12 noon, but we want to stay as long as we can and answer any questions that you have. So the floor is open for questions to anyone on the panel. Or comments. Or that you're shocked and overwhelmed and we can shut down.
I have two questions. One is how One of the entities is creative work. So how is a creative work different from a work in Ferber? I saw that, for example, a creative work has a creator, in Ferber it doesn't. In Ferber, a work has no creator. A manifestation has. But, and my second question is, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the rationale behind introducing the annotation entity. For example, for cover art. Why with RDF it seems possible to have a cover art entity and a resource and then just connect it with has cover art. And if you need additional metadata about this relationship, you can use a name graph and a name graph identifier. Why introduce an annotation? Introduce an annotation entity that seems to be as part of the domain model? That seems to just complicate things and removes things a couple of degrees from a direct, semantically valid relationship between two resources.
So, I mean, I guess I'll take the work question, and then Kevin can take the annotation one. But, you know, the short answer is you just identified a couple of the differences of, you know, you've answered, in essence, part of your question. You know, at a certain level, there's confusion over the fact that both use work. You know, naming things aside, that's a difficult task. Secondly, you know, these models aren't designed to be one-to-one. I don't think that would serve the goals of BibFrame to be one-to-one with Ferber or any of the other underlying models of any of the other content standards that, in essence, BibFrame is trying to achieve. So, you know, there are going to be similarities that you'll see between, you know, work and Ferber work. There'll be similarities and difference that you'll see between work and schema.org creative work. I mean, I'm not answering your direct question, but indirectly, just to say, you know, what this is really designed to be is sort of a lightweight, not lightweight in the sense of easy per se, or simplified, but in terms of small, reusable, recombinable modeling. So there are going to be differences. Again, if you want to restrict the BibFrame model to a certain kind of profile that maps more into the BibFrame notion, there's ways of doing that. And as Sally mentioned, that's in fact part of the next phase of work, is to sort of provide those kind of profiling mechanisms that'll make it possible. But I don't think we should read too much just yet into one-to-one alignment and really use more of this experimentation as a way of quickly iterating over the pros and cons and benefits of what both have to offer. I'll let Kevin sort of talk about the annotation bits next.
I'm going to address the cover art question specifically, but I'd actually just prefer to back that up just a little bit to the general notion of an annotation. And the way we've defined it as such, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and also to be clear about our definition of it in case there's an alternate view out there. An annotation is additional information about another BibFrame resource, a work, or an instance. It's probably true, it's probably accurate, but it might not necessarily be of general interest to everybody. One of the ways I tend to like to look at this is from a work or instance perspective. The information associated with BibFrame works and instances, or I should say BibFrame works and instances could be control, and the information about them doesn't change, generally speaking. The facts asserted about works and instances are true and of general interest to everybody. Publication dates don't change, places of publication don't change, and that type of information is going to be of general interest to everybody who's looking at that particular instance. And the annotation aspect of the BibFrame model allows people to make additional assertions about these other resources that are equally true and equally valid, but not necessarily of general interest to everybody. the cover art example is one of those ones that, on the one hand, you think to yourself, why does this require an annotation? Could you not just point to the image as you propose? On the other hand, and I should also say that it's very early in the model still, so maybe that happens if everyone community-wide agrees on that. That being said, what presently happens in the library community is people, whether or not well, they just do. They contract with image providing services. So not necessarily everyone is using, in fact, the same cover art, one, and two, they're certainly not necessarily all using the same supplier for those cover art images. The annotation model would allow suppliers to say this cover art image annotates this resource, and would allow multiple providers to make that type of assertion, and at which point the library is empowered to choose whichever provider it wants to for that. So that would be, at this moment in time, a defense for the cover art annotation being distinct, or being not just a simple link to the image. Does that address the question?
Well, I think RDF has a built-in annotation feature, which is called name graph.
So it doesn't. I mean, the point is, so whether you know, that's something people are working on, and the annotation model at a certain level is another way of doing it. It's whether name graphs or annotation models. These are mechanisms that I think all of us want to see happen with respect to provenance. Who makes this assertion? When it get made? There's a lot of different ways that the W3C is sort of exploring. Sorry, not even the W3. Different groups are trying to explore this. The provenance vocabulary is an attempt to do this. The annotation vocabulary is an early attempt to do this. I actually expect that there will be stronger reconciliation throughout this, but they sort of share the goal. Name graphs, provenance, annotations. You know, I expect tighter alignment as we start to figure this out, but they all share the same goal of being able to make those outside assertions and find out who said it so that we can then act on them accordingly. They're not radically different views here, and I suspect that, you know, as we continue to experiment, that alignment will make it clearer and clearer.
A question for Eric. In thinking about the Google search results screen you had with the knowledge graph on the Einstein example, what do we need to do so that library metadata can start appearing there? And do we need to worry that Wikipedia has already beaten us to the punch?
So that's what's so exciting about this. I mean, at a certain level, what we need to do to start to see it appear there is simply publish it to the web, basically using these bib frame vocabularies. You know, is a very small step between what we do right now and the huge benefit that we would basically see by simply making this available in linked data, you know, in this vocabulary. So it's not a huge radical gap. And Wikipedia hasn't gotten us there. I mean, what's so exciting is, you know, it's an initial attempt to try, you know, Wikipedia is a great resource, and what you see on the knowledge graph is an integration of Wikipedia, Freebase, the CIA Factbook, and I imagine in a very short time, if we exposed our data, library data. And the amount of volume that we would see in terms of folks coming back to the library, you know, connecting back into the library resources, then connecting into the special collections that each library might have about Albert Einstein or any particular thing. You know, the gap from going, you know, to exposing this to new ways in which folks come back to the library is very small. If we stop fighting the web and just become part of it.
If I understood the description of the roadmap correctly, the goal was to have, or is to have, the high level vocabularies and modeling finalized by the end of the year. Is that correct?
I think I said that most things will be finalized next year, but by the end of the year, you should be close if that's the way it works out. We certainly will be we want to have the conversation about that throughout the year.
And is the intention to to finalize the high-level work before then proceeding to lower-level, more granular work? And if so, what happens if there's a problem discovered later with the modeling or experimentation with the lower-level work that impacts upon the...
Could you describe what you mean by lower-level work?
Well, it was more granular transformations of the data that we all have in MARC records, which is necessary for library systems to function, that may have less of an import on how the rest of the web might interact with this data, but is important if BibFrame is to become a replacement for MARC. At the very least.
I'd like to say something about that. One of the points of discussion in one of the workshops was some thinking about sort of almost a prioritization of that granularity. So, you know, we know from various research projects that some data in the MARC environment is highly used. So there are a few tags that comprise most of the data, let's say. I think that you could generalize that as being demonstrated in a number of research projects. And then there are some where, the data is of interest to specialists or, small communities. And so one of the points of discussion was, can we get a view on that, and can that inform sort of the modeling activity? So I think I would say, to answer your question, at least from my perspective, one way to approach this is not so much that we figure out all the top level stuff and then we come back to lower level stuff later. I think what we want to do here is essentially prioritize, first agree on the fundamentals, and then and then get started. Start producing data, under that with some of the important, let's say, or more highly used data that's represented. And then as we iterate, as we improve, we sort of go down the chain. That's certainly my view of one way to approach this. So I wouldn't think of it as, at the end of the year we're going to have this and then we're going to come back to a bunch of stuff. I think this will iterate over time, and the focus on the data modeling and these transformation tools should really be on the data that's highly used in the existing MARC data, and then we can go from there. With also a view to, well, what's also the data that's relevant, for this web exposure concepts? Let's connect to that as well.
I want to add one thing. Code is being written all the time. So we don't have, when Ted's talking about, looking at things and trying to deal with them, there's that discussion, and then there's the putting it to practical use or putting it into implementation to determine feasibility. So we're not going to find ourselves out, well, the idea is not to find ourselves out, in a year with this exceptionally detailed vocabulary, but then it comes time to write transformations. No, they'll be going hand in hand during that entire period.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure if I can formulate this too well, but I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between BibFrame and the models that the library world has thus far invested so much effort in, RDA, Ferber, and so forth. So I understand where you're coming from, where you're saying you don't want to model this like one-to-one. We're just going to make BibFrame so it works for RDA. Although historically, of course, there has been a lot of ACR2 and MARC have been much more sort of intertwined than maybe theoretically was desirable. But on the other hand, if BibFrame can't sort of fully express what we put into RDA and Ferber, then that's going to be a problem, I think. And so, what is it, for example, some of my concerns on the listserv about Ferber and the different kinds of relationships, and this whole thing with the one work to, the many-to-one relationships and the way that the instance can only be related to one work then doesn't really line up with the approach that Ferber's trying to take in sort of in modeling the world. So I guess, could you just say a little more about how you plan to then turn this around and make sure that we don't lose the ability to express RDA and Ferber? Or is that not the intention?
Let me say just one thing. Let me say just one thing. One thing about RDA, I think, or the real power of RDA is relationships. It's not hierarchy, it's relationships. Hierarchy is one form of relationship within RDA. And that's what we're focusing on also, are relationships. Because after all, the work to expression is a relationship. The expression to manifestation is a relationship. And so I hope that, and that's just our model that we want to be sure that we support. There are other communities that have other kinds of even hierarchical relationships that we want to also be sure they can support. So I appreciate your concern, and we have it on the radar constantly, frankly, because we know that how important that is. But we also have tried to stay focused on relationships, and I think RDA focuses on relationships. I think we focus ourselves, we talk about RDA with respect to Ferber a little too much, rather than concentrating on what RDA is really all about, which is the relationships. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to amplify that, but slightly different. It's not that you can't, both BibFrame can basically, deal with the same expressiveness as Ferber. I mean, you're not losing anything in terms of rich descriptions. It's just how it gets described right now is slightly different. And the way that sorry.
His lunch date is calling.
Sorry. That was a reminder I need to eat. No, I mean, so it takes a very relationship-oriented approach to this, so you can still basically deal with, describing very complex relationships and very complex aggregate works and all sorts of other things. So I want to distinguish the difference between, can one be more expressive than the other? They both are equally expressive. To how do you do it? And I think the how do you do it part is at a certain level, what we need to focus more on in terms of the use cases and examples and everything else. So, I mean, the dialogue that you started on the list is exactly right to start that discussion, and I think that it'll work itself out in the very near term. It may be very simply that what we just need to do is figure out how best to project it, to these two things together. And I don't think we're terribly far off. I do think, however, that keeping these things separate is exactly the right model, exactly the right approach, in the sense that there are lots of other content standards that we want to project in here so that we all benefit from that. And I think that one of the parts that Sally mentioned in her roadmap is really working on these profiles, and that starts, that work basically started last week, and we expect to really have an initial stab at what that looks like really in the next couple months, and with these kind of discussions and the list kinds of discussions, we may even get there sooner. I don't think we're that far off, to be honest, but this is about sort of recasting that model at a certain level back into the web. There's a very web-centric approach to BibFrame. It doesn't lend itself as directly to a hierarchical inheritance model. I don't think that's a bad thing. And trying to figure out how to put these things together is actually going to be, what we do next.
Well, just to put in one plug for the hierarchical aspect, of course I do agree that relationships are really important, but what we found in our work with moving images is that you can reduce a lot of the redundancy in our existing records, and it would be a big win for data maintenance we really had the kind of work that Ferber describes, especially when you talked about a feature film when there's a whole ton of information. This doesn't come out so much maybe in your mainstream, paperback nonfiction book where there isn't so much repeating information, but that would be my one plug for that. And then I did have one other kind of question that sort of occurred to me. When Reinhold was talking, he talked about using Pika as the internal format and then BibFrame, and these other things for communication formats. And of course, that was a fundamental function, is a fundamental function of MARC, is to be a communication format. And then we're talking about BibFrame as being a communication format with the web, a further way to sort of communicate our data. But then is it seen that BibFrame is going to be a format that catalogers or other people would work directly with, or would people have some other kind of internal format that then would get translated to BibFrame? And would that possibly then leave us a little bit more dependent on MARC longer than we would like to be if people sort of keep MARC in the back end?
I think what people do in the privacy of their own systems is their business. And what we should really be focusing on are how to basically exchange the information from one end to the other. Your point about a hierarchical management system for managing your kind of metadata is perfect. I mean, if that works for you, no one should stop that particular, effort. But what might work for one class of information might not be the thing that works for another class of info, which might not be the thing that works for serials or everything else. Different systems will optimize for different kinds of management, and that's okay. But when we want to start talking about an exchange format that basically we can use across these things, trying to standardize on something that works for one system, is not necessarily the thing that should work across all of them. So trying to get that sort of balance is really what I think we're trying to achieve here. And how to project, in essence, what might work inside of one system into the BibFrame model is something that's certainly going to have to be the challenge. Pika is dealing with how to project their internal model that works for them into BibFrame. OCLC is projecting what their internal model, CDF or something like that, into BibFrame. If you've got an object relational inheritance model that works for you, figuring out how to project it into BibFrame is something else. But trying to standardize on that internal structure for everybody is really a tough thing. And I think it misses the opportunity of trying to basically come up with a flexible framework that can be used in even partial ways across these different communities. Because even though we might think about describing something in a particular context, its value is useful far outside of that. And this is about exposing the value of our assets far outside the boundaries in which we've traditionally done so.
I think my comment may be sort of outside of the purview of this discussion, but I really do think RD and BibFrame and all those should maybe think about what other people are doing, mainly in metadata programs, data mining, big data. I think there's a lot going on here that people are going in, reinventing the wheel and going in different directions.
Do you say amen to that?
I think that's just, thanks.
On the issue of small communities, some which have needs for hierarchy and data orderliness, isn't there a need to, as you perhaps came close to describing, find a way to map those community interests into BibFrame. But I was a little worried that you were stopping short by suggesting that, well, if your need is really specialized, you may need a local extension, but But if that's the case, if small communities need a local extension, then an exchange format really isn't working for them, because they can't exchange to using the common exchange format without that local extension being understood by other systems.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And I would say we haven't spent a lot of time on this at this point, so I think this is, to some degree unresolved. I mean, the balance that you're talking about, I think is an important one to consider.
With that, we will let that be the last question and official comment. The Library of Congress thanks all the panel members, their experimenters, and we thank you for your attendance, those of you who are still there, but we need to clear out for the 1 o'clock session that will follow here. Stay tuned to us with the various listservs and the website. Again, thank you very much, and see you at the same place, same time in Chicago on Sunday in June.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.